Everybody, it's Johnny Two-Face here, back with another reaction video. This time I'm reacting to Napoleon and the Battle of Eylau 1807 by Epic History TV. Now, like everyone else, I don't know why this wasn't included in the series in the first place, but now we finally got it. A more detailed events of the Battle of Eylau. Again, I know it should have been in the original series, but then I'm not going to go into speculate why, but anyway. So, let's see how much of this I remember. Yeah, just after the Battle of Jena and Auerstadt, and before the Battle of Friedland, and Napoleon in Warsaw having an affair with Marie Walewska, and Prussia was devastated by what was described as a Napoleonic blitzkrieg, and Prussia also hoping for the Russians to save their kingdom, but anyone who's already watched this series knows what's going to happen. So the usual disclaimer when I react to any historical content: if I don't show so much what is considered a proper reaction, is probably obvious I don't know much about the subject at hand, and if I do know anything, I'll most likely pause the video to give my input or ask any curious questions, which hopefully will be answered in the comments below. So, I've said what I've had to say so far, so the link to the original video will be in the description down below. Please go and subscribe to Epic History TV. In my opinion, one of the best history channels on YouTube, among several. And, yeah, that's really all I can add at the moment, so let's get this on screen. Yep, captions are on. And, let's see what's going on in this video.
January 1807. French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, victor of Ulm, Austerlitz and Jena, was near the height of his powers. His Grande Armée had swept all before it. Now, in the depths of a bitter Polish winter, he sought the final victory that would make him master of Europe. His target, the Russians, supported by the remains of the Prussian army. But many months of campaigning had exhausted even his toughest veterans. Most had not seen France in years, and the war in Poland seemed to offer only freezing mud, hunger, and a stubborn enemy who did not know when he was beaten.
Because I think if I remembered from the video about the Battle of Friedland, amongst the French army didn't really have much love for Poland. In their view, it was freezing, impoverished, and they missed home. From what I remember, desertion rates soared, like almost pretty much into the hundreds, and there were over 100 cases of soldiers committing suicide.
At Poltusk, the Russians had fought courageously and thwarted Napoleon's first attempt to outmaneuver their army. But another opportunity...
Well, to be fair, they did capture a French courier, if I remember, delivering the orders to Marshal Bernadotte. Could be wrong on that one.
Unity would soon emerge. Command of the Russian army had recently passed to General Levin August von Bennigsen. Despite his German name and Hanoverian roots, he was a veteran of 34 years' service with the Imperial Russian Army. On the 27th of January, with 77,000 Russians and 13,000 Prussians, Bennigsen launched a surprise winter offensive, targeting Marshal Ney's exposed 6th Corps.
Which, I think Marshal Ney, from what I remember from the other videos in this series, he was him and his corps and another corps were looking for better winter quarters.
But Ney escaped, and Bernadotte's First Corps fought a successful rearguard action at Moringen. Now Napoleon would turn the tables on Bennigsen. As soon as he'd learned of the Russian advance, he'd begun planning a grand encirclement of the enemy. Suddenly, it was the Russians who were exposed. But Bennigsen got wind of Napoleon's trap just in time and began a hurried withdrawal.
Oh, my mistake. That was when the Russians captured a French courier. Yeah, towards Heilsberg.
5 days of relentless marching followed, with Marshal Murat's vanguard nipping at the Russians' heels all the way.
Yep.
But despite a series of furious assaults on their rearguard, ably commanded by Prince Bagration, the French could not break through. The pursuit continued, even as temperatures plummeted. To the north, Ney shadowed Lestocq's Prussian Corps, while Soult's 4th Corps followed the Russian rearguard to the small East Prussian town of Eylau.
Battle of Eylau. Day 1.
On the afternoon of the 7th of February, Marshal Soult's troops advanced up the icy road to Eylau. They found it held by General Barclay de Tolly's Russian division, entrenched along a line of fences, ditches, and barricades. Just before dusk, confused combat began around the town's cemetery. More and more troops were sucked into the bitter fighting. The French took the cemetery with a bayonet charge, but then had to hold it against a determined Russian counterattack, led by Barclay himself, who was seriously wounded by grape shot. Vicious street fighting continued well into the night, but the French ultimately prevailed, with the loss of 4,000 casualties on each side. Soldiers and officers alike were astonished by the savagery of the engagement. As darkness fell, temperatures dropped dramatically. Many of the wounded froze to death where they had fallen. The French ransacked Eylau for food and firewood. Many Russian soldiers had to sleep in open fields, wrapped only in their greatcoats, forbidden to light fires. That night, Napoleon's greatest concern was that the Russians would slip away under cover of darkness, robbing him of the decisive battle he craved. He need not have worried. Bennigsen was done running. Here, at Eylau, the Russians would make their stand. Is something interfering with your happiness, or preventing you from achieving your goals? If so, therapy can be a valuable tool in helping you to live a happier, more fulfilled life. This is an advert for BetterHelp, who are making therapy more accessible.
Feel free to check them out if you're interested. Day 2. It was a vast hurricane of death that seemed to smash and erase from the face of the earth. It was a vast hurricane of death that seemed to smash and erase from the face of the earth everything in its path. Denis Davidov, Lieutenant of Lifeguard Hussars. God, it would help if I read that right in the first place.
Before dawn, Napoleon was on Eylau's cemetery knoll, trying to make out the Russian lines through his telescope. He was surprised by what he saw. 67,000 Russians packed into 2 great lines along a 3-mile front, with well-defended villages anchoring both flanks. Open ground lay between the 2 armies, providing a clear field of fire for Bennigsen's 400 guns, a huge amount of artillery for an army of the age. Napoleon had Soult and Augereau's depleted corps, plus the Imperial Guard and Murat's reserve cavalry, just 45,000 men and 137 guns. But Napoleon was expecting Davout's Third Corps, 15,000 men, to arrive at any moment, in perfect position to fall on the Russian flank. At dawn, as French troops were still getting into position, hundreds of Russian guns opened a massive bombardment.
It's not every day you see an army that has more artillery than Napoleon.
In Eylau, there was chaos, as round shot crashed through buildings and tore through men.
Bear in mind, like ship battles, it's not just the cannonballs that cause damage, it's the shrapnel of whatever the cannonball hits. That is also a massive killer.
French guns soon answered the Russians in kind.
Yep.
It was the largest combined artillery bombardment the world had yet seen. It lasted nearly 3 hours.
Oh, wow.
While Bennigsen had quantity, French crews were more experienced, and against the densely packed Russian lines, they couldn't miss. Meanwhile, Davout's 2 leading divisions arrived on the battlefield, dangerously placed on the Russian left flank. But before they could attack, Prince Galitzin struck first with his cavalry brigade. Davout's veterans threw back the horsemen with disciplined fire. Galitzin's charge, however, bought time for General Bagavout to reorganize his defensive line to face the new threat. When the Iron Marshal attacked around 8 a.m., he found the enemy entrenched on a ridge with formidable artillery support. Davout's lead division was mauled, suffering 1,500 casualties as it was thrown back. This check on Davout alarmed Napoleon. He feared the Russians might withdraw before his trap could close. It was, he decided, the battle's critical moment. Orders flew out to Marshal Augereau's 7th Corps and General Saint-Hilaire's division. They were to launch a frontal attack against the enemy. At all costs, the Russians' escape must be prevented.
All was disorder, confusion, stupor, and under an avalanche of blows. French staff officer of Marshal Augereau's corps.
The 49-year-old Marshal Augereau had been with Napoleon since his first command in Italy and the brilliant campaign of '96. But he was deeply unwell that morning. At 10 a.m., strapped to his horse, he led forward the 12,000 troops of 7th Corps, just as heavy snow began to fall. With visibility down to a few feet, Augereau's divisions drifted off course, straight into the murderous artillery duel.
Damn.
French and Russian cannonballs tore through their ranks. Augereau's men pushed on doggedly. But as they neared the Russian line, the blizzard suddenly lifted.
Oh dear.
One division found itself facing 70 Russian guns at a range of just 30 yards. Seconds later, its forward ranks were obliterated by Russian canister.
Yep.
Another French division broke through the enemy line, only to be surrounded on 3 sides by Russian bayonets and annihilated. Augereau's horse was killed under him, leaving him badly injured. As the survivors of his corps stumbled back the way they'd come, Russian cavalry and infantry surged forward. Units were overrun, entire regiments swallowed up. Order and discipline collapsed. One of the few units to maintain order was the 14th Infantry, nicknamed the Brave for its heroic role at Rivoli 10 years before. But now they were outnumbered and surrounded. The regiment resisted bravely, but was cut to pieces, suffering 75% casualties and the loss of its Eagle standard. In the space of just 30 minutes, the Russians inflicted 5,000 casualties on Augereau's 7th Corps. Effectively, it had ceased to exist. It was one of the worst battlefield disasters of the Napoleonic Wars. For the French, Eylau was no longer a fight for victory, but a struggle for survival.
Are you going to let those fellows devour us? Napoleon to Marshal Murat.
From Eylau's cemetery knoll, Napoleon watched the catastrophe engulfing Augereau's corps. He knew he must stabilize the situation immediately and buy time to reorganize his center and for Davout's corps to arrive in force. So the Emperor turned to Murat and his large cavalry reserve. It was a desperate gamble.
Yep.
The horses were tired and suffering from the cold. They'd be outnumbered and unsupported by infantry. But the flamboyant, apparently fearless Marshal Murat was undaunted. He assembled 40 squadrons of cavalry, 5,000 dragoons and cuirassiers, and led them forward. So began one of the legendary cavalry charges of the Napoleonic Wars. Unable to move much faster than a walk due to the terrible conditions, Murat's cavalry nevertheless presented a formidable wall of men, horses, and steel. General Grouchy's dragoons, in the lead, drove back the advancing Russians. D'Hautpoul's steel-clad cuirassiers then thundered forward on their giant horses. Finding a gap between two Russian divisions, they used it to pry open the enemy line. With seemingly unstoppable momentum, the riders surged forward. But it could not last. As they neared Bennigsen's headquarters, a Russian battery blasted the French horsemen with canister. D'Hautpoul himself was mortally wounded. French momentum was lost. As the Russian counterattack began, Murat ordered his squadrons to regroup and pull back. He almost didn't make it. The Russian 4th Division had moved to block his escape. Seeing this, Napoleon ordered Marshal Bessieres to lead forward the Guard cavalry. These were 2,000 of the finest cavalry in Europe, and to cheers of "Vive l'Empereur!" they advanced into the whirling mass of shot and snow. When Colonel Lepic saw his men ducking, he called out, "Heads up, by God! Those are bullets, not turds."
Wow.
Chasseurs of the Guard charged down the first Russian infantry square they met, scattered the enemy's gunners, and cut out a path for Murat's retreating squadrons. The French charge at Eylau would go down as one of the boldest, most desperate military maneuvers of the age. The losses were terrible in men and horses, but it succeeded in its mission. The Russian advance had been stopped in its tracks, and the initiative had swung back to Napoleon.
All attention on both sides was now riveted on Davout and our left wing. The situation did not appear very rosy.
Marshal Davout's 3rd Corps, the famed heroes of Auerstedt 4 months before, had now arrived in sufficient force to launch a full-scale assault. Anticipating this, Bagavout withdrew to a new defensive line on the Kriegerberge, a dominating height perfect for artillery. 2 hours of chaotic fighting followed, with every French advance challenged by a fierce Russian counterattack. But supported by dragoons and Saint-Hilaire's division, 3rd Corps slowly ground down the enemy. Bennigsen was forced to send in his last reserve, Kaminsky's 14th Division. Supported by cavalry, it drove the French from Klein Sausgarten and across the fields beyond until its own advance was checked by French artillery. When Davout resumed his attack at 3 p.m, the Russian line buckled. The Kriegerberge was taken. So too Bennigsen's headquarters at Auklappen. Bennigsen scraped together enough units to improvise a new defensive line, but French guns, hauled up to the Kriegerberge, opened up a devastating fire. The French pressure was irresistible. The Russian flank would surely collapse at any moment, handing Napoleon the decisive victory he so desperately sought. All that was required was one final push.
Good God, the Prussians are here too. French officer in Eylau.
Early that morning, Bennigsen had sent urgent orders to Prussian General Anton von Lestock to join the main army with his corps as quickly as possible. Although nearly 70, Lestock was still as energetic as he'd been serving under Frederick the Great, and was assisted by a highly capable chief of staff, Colonel Gerhard von Scharnhorst. Lestock's corps, 9,000 men, was 8 miles northwest of Eylau, closely watched by Marshal Ney's 6th Corps. His orders were to prevent the Prussians linking up with the Russians at all costs. But by force-marching his troops along frozen, hilly country roads, Lestock was able to bypass Ney's blocking force. To Bennigsen's joy, by early afternoon, the Prussians had reached Schmödeten. With his left flank crumbling, there was no time to lose. At 4 p.m, Lestock's Prussians charged forward. By now, Davout's men had been marching and fighting for many hours and were utterly spent. They managed a few ragged volleys before they turned and ran. Russian cavalry followed in pursuit. Marshal Davout, with just one intact division left, prepared to make a stand on the Kriegerberge. The brave, he shouted, will find a glorious death here. Fortunately for Davout, the enemy's attacks were poorly coordinated, and his 40-gun battery inflicted terrible losses. Around 5:30, as dusk fell, Ney's corps arrived in pursuit of the Prussians and took Schlödeten. This new threat forced Bennigsen to call off his attack on Davout. And as darkness descended, the day's slaughter finally came to an end.
No matter where one looked, one saw nothing but corpses, and beheld men dragging themselves over the ground. One heard nothing but heart-rending cries. I went away horror-struck. Jean-Baptiste Barras, chasseur, French Imperial Guard.
Since Napoleon had crowned himself emperor in 1804, every campaign, every battle he'd waged had ended in brilliant success. No longer. Bennigsen, learning the true scale of his army's losses and its critical shortage of ammunition, withdrew overnight. The French were left holding a frozen, corpse-strewn battlefield, allowing Napoleon to claim a victory. But in reality, Eylau had been a murderous slaughter, without a winner. As Marshal Ney exclaimed on seeing the battlefield, "What a massacre!" and without result. Exact casualty figures are unknown, due to the chaos and conditions of the battle and the scale of loss. But it is likely that the Russians lost 20,000 men, killed, wounded or captured. The French, perhaps as many as 25,000. What is clear is that thousands of French veterans, the victors of Ulm, Austerlitz and Jena, met their end on the snowy fields of East Prussia. Napoleon's Grande Armée would go on to achieve more great victories, including a crushing victory over Bennigsen's Russians at Friedland 4 months later. But after the brutal losses of Eylau, it was never the same. Thank you to the artists Keith Rocco and Alexander Avrianov for kind permission to use their artworks in this video. Big thanks also to our old collaborator History March for creating the battlefield map used in this episode. You can enjoy many more excellent military history videos on his own YouTube channel. And thank you to all the Epic History TV Patreon supporters who voted for this topic and make this channel possible. Visit our Patreon page to find out how you can support.
And that'll do it. This is wow, such a great video, again by Epic History TV, and it's nice to see the finer details of the Battle of Eylau. And wow, and you can understand that saying from Marshal Ney, "What a massacre without any result." Wow. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this reaction. If you like this reaction, please like, comment and subscribe, and I will see you in the